Welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Lawrence A. Strick, I'm Peter B. Collins. Today, we'll spend the entire show with one guest, Democratic Congressman Jared Huffman of San Rafael. After 6 years in the state assembly, Jared won the 12-candidate race when Lynn Woolsey retired last year.
Congressman, welcome to Marin Voices and Views again.
Thank you both. Good to be with you.
Great. As a new member of Congress and a member who's in the minority and just getting your feet and dipping your toes into this pool over there, what have you found to be a surprise, or things that are great or things that are less great for you?
Well, there are lots of surprises. It's a big job. It's a new job. I have a district, of course, that's really large. It goes from the Golden Gate Bridge all the way up to the Oregon border. So I'm finding things all the time. Some of the bad things that people see, and I know how badly the approval ratings are for Congress right now. I knew a lot of that going in. I knew there was going to be a divided Congress. I knew that there was going to be gridlock and dysfunction. But some of the idiosyncrasies about being in the House of Representatives you can't really appreciate till you get there. So I could tell you lots of stories.
Well, give us an example.
Well, one example is I think the public has this image of debates in the House of Representatives actually happening with members on the floor participating, listening to each other. Doesn't really work that way. The way it actually works is most of the debating is done on procedural rules that precede the votes, with only a half dozen or so members even on the floor. Everybody else is up in their offices. And then when the procedural stuff is done and it's time to call the vote, members come down from their offices to the floor, they mill about, chat with each other, do some business, cast the vote, and leave. The process is much less deliberative than I think C-SPAN perhaps reveals. And much less deliberative than it was in the state legislature, where you really did have all the members on the floor participating and debating kind of in whatever way they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Yet they call it the People's House. I mean, you hear this all the time. Is that frustrating for a new member, or is just doing business like I'm supposed to, because that's the way these other guys are doing it?
It's not the way I would like it to work.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think as a new member, as a freshman in a seniority-based institution, as one out of 535 members of the legislative branch, I have to also have a little humility. I'm not going to change the place, just by virtue of my arrival. So we'll keep working on it, and I hope we can make it better over time.
Jared, one of the things that came as a real surprise to me in recent weeks was when the president introduced his proposal on the chained CPI, and this amounts to a formula to cut future increases in Social Security benefits. And it's stunning that this comes from a Democratic president, that he appears to be negotiating with himself, because it's not like, oh, this is the onerous thing I have to do over here so that I can get this thing over here. And further, we all know that Social Security is not a driver of the annual budget deficit or the long-term debt. So can you help us understand this and explain your position?
If I thought there was good strategy or wisdom behind it, I perhaps could help you understand it. I don't understand it myself, for all the reasons that you just mentioned. This is the first time in history a Democratic president has proposed a reduction in Social Security. And I think it does buy into this false notion that somehow the long-term solvency of Social Security is part of our deficit and debt discussion, which it is not, at least right now, and it is not projected to really be a part of that for many years to come. So I think it's bad policy. I also think it's bad strategy, because this was a deal that he offered at the end of last year as part of the big grand bargain. And Speaker Boehner and the Republicans turned it down. And to sort of come back into a new phase of negotiating with the last best final offer that you had rejected before sort of invites even further compromising. So I don't get it at all. I do want to make real clear, though, that I oppose playing around with that inflation factor, because that's just a way of reducing benefits for seniors. And the inflation protection of Social Security is really an important piece of how it's stood the test of time. You can sort of imagine that if seniors were still getting the Social Security benefits that were offered in the 1940s Social Security really wouldn't be doing its job today.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to maintain that inflation protection is really important, and when you start playing around with it, that's just a bad precedent to begin.
Now let me acknowledge that I'm in cahoots with Alan Grayson, your colleague from Florida, and he wrote what's called the Grayson-Takano letter, which essentially is a pledge never to vote to cut Social Security benefits. Your position seems strikingly similar to his, but you've declined to sign the letter. Tell us why.
That easy explanation. Alan and I do have the same position on the issue. But I also have a position that I think these absolutist vote pledges are a bad idea. I think it's part of what has sort of straitjacketed Congress. So it doesn't mean I don't have strong and in some cases immovable positions. It just means that I don't think it's productive to run around signing pledge cards that people put in front of you. In fact, I made a point of not doing that during my 6 years in the State Assembly, was very proud of that, and I campaigned on the fact that I wouldn't do it when I got to Congress. I think that tactic has proven very effective for folks like Grover Norquist and the anti-tax folks on the right. But just because it's been effective at shutting down problem solving in Congress and shutting down needed tax revenues doesn't mean that I think we ought to adopt it for each and every issue that we feel strongly about.
Isn't there a significant difference, though, between the Norquist no new taxes pledge and a pledge not to cut, essentially to change a contract with a whole group of beneficiaries, and I'm on track to become one of them?
Oh,
My self-interest is at
the
stake.
issues are very different. One of them's right, one of them's wrong, but the tactic is identical. And that's where I think at some point, if you want to start creating a better tone and better problem solving in government, some of these tactics need to give way. So that's where Mr. Grayson and I part ways. It's not over the issue, it's just over the tactic. We're voting the same way, you know, and I've been very clear on how I would vote, and I've articulated my position, but I'm just not going to run around signing cards and pledges.
So we're in a situation now where there's this thing called a sequester.
Yeah.
You've spoken out against it, and that is apparently now looking at individual issues as of the last couple of weeks. The Congress just voted to change the sequester as it applies to airports. Yep. There's other issues that they're looking at. But they're not looking at it in terms of kids who have cancer or Head Start programs. Are we taking are the Democrats taking a dive on this?
I don't see this as Democrat or Republican. I see this as an outgrowth of a really terrible policy, the sequester. It was designed to be awful public policy to the point where, you know, it was intended to be so bad that no one would let it happen. Unfortunately, I think what we've seen once again is that particularly the Tea Party class of 2010 that continues to govern the House of Representatives really prefers ideology to just about everything else. And so this battering ram of the sequester, because it does achieve $1 trillion thereabouts of deficit reduction and shrinks the size of government, is something that they came to accept and came to support, basically.
Isn't there a fear, however, that this notion of sequester and looking at each individual expenditure becomes institutionalized, and that becomes the new norm, and all of a sudden each and every program that could be blown up in the press just doesn't get taken care of anymore?
Yeah, it is offensive that you're cherry picking certain things, whether it's defense, which did get some flexibility from the sequester in the continuing resolution bill that was passed about a month ago, or whether it's this latest thing with the air traffic controllers and the impacts on flight delays. And so you're faced with a choice when something like that happens. Do you support something that at least makes it somewhat better, or do you oppose it because it's not including Head Start and Section 8 housing and other things that I think need relief too? And it's a tough choice, but I can understand why we would take whatever progress we could get and keep working, because the sequester, remember, the sequester expires in September. So we're going to have a chance to revisit the entire package and hopefully replace it with something better.
Now, these across-the-board cuts are already hurting economic growth. And it's clear to me that you can't make real reductions to the annual budget deficit or the long-term debt without substantial cuts to defense and intelligence spending. Yet, it seems that that is completely off the table. In Washington, inside the Beltway bubble, it's like you're out of line if you stand up and say, well, can we just look at the numbers, because the biggest source of the deficit is our increased defense spending?
Well, it's not totally off the table, Peter. What I would say is this: if you add up the Budget Control Act reductions that were set in motion that include some pretty deep defense cuts, and the sequester, you actually are on course to, within the next year or two, bringing the defense budget down to where it has historically been in peacetime as a percentage of our GDP. So it has been a part of the correction that is needed. I think we can go a lot further. I think we can look at some base closures. I think we can look at our forward deployment around the world and really achieve much bigger savings that will contribute. But I think, to be fair, it has been, at least in the last 2 or 3 years, receiving some pretty significant reductions. And the drawdown, of course, from Afghanistan is going to bring a big pile of money that we call OCO, the Overseas Contingency and Operations Fund, that'll be available now to do some more productive things.
So will there be a peace dividend? We didn't get one after the Cold War.
Guess what paid for that sequester relief for the air traffic controllers? The peace dividend.
Mm-hmm.
It was a gimmick. It was basically using that OCO fund and grabbing a little bit of an advance and buying out the furloughs of air traffic controllers.
And that's because they would refuse to have any tax revenues or fee
Exactly.
revenues.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it really is just accounting
Yeah.
at some level.
Feels a lot like Sacramento these days. We saw those kind of gimmicks a lot during the tough budget years under the Schwarzenegger administration.
Yeah, I remember he was going to blow up those boxes and cut up the credit cards.
Yeah.
He was governor?
You forgot already.
It was just a role.
Oh, okay.
And he
Yeah,
didn't win an Oscar.
Right, no,
Definitely
he did not win an Oscar. You mentioned the size and scope of your district.
Mm-hmm.
That goes from beautiful San Francisco, the Bay, all the way up the coast. And I noticed that you just introduced your first bill was to add some new public lands in the Mendocino County off that coast. Tell us what's up with that.
Well, I'm excited. Thanks for asking about that. There is this thing called the California Coastal National Monument. And I don't know if most people know it exists, but it's something that Bill Clinton did during his presidency using a piece of legislation called the Antiquities Act of 1906. Great piece of law that allowed Teddy Roosevelt to save the Grand Canyon. Has been used by both Republican and Democrat presidents over the last century, and President Clinton used it to protect all of the islands and rocks and rookeries, off the coast of California from any type of future development. This bill I'm introducing would be the first land-based addition to that coastal national monument, and it's an area of land about 2,400 acres in Point Arena in Mendocino County. It would help connect up about 10 miles of the coastal trail. It includes some amazing coastal and upland habitat. It includes the Garcia River estuary, which is a really important place for coho salmon and other threatened and endangered species. And it's in public ownership. Through a number of new deals, we've been able to acquire all of these properties, and we now want to protect them in perpetuity. So it's a really great candidate to be the first land-based addition, and it has no opposition. Everybody supports it. The local landowners, the local community, local business community, because ecotourism is a huge part of the Mendocino County economy. And so I've introduced the bill. I have a hearing on it this next week. It'll be my first time presenting a piece of legislation in committee. And we're not sure if Chairman Doc Hastings granting a hearing on my bill means he's interested in working with me, or whether this is the ritual smackdown of the freshman liberal from California. So we're ready for either scenario, and we'll see how it goes.
I'm glad you have that attitude. Jared, in April, you held a forum here in San Rafael about election reform. Tell us what you see as the key issues. This is something that I think is very important in maintaining a democracy.
Well, I agree with you, and that's why the first public meeting I had as a member of Congress, I chose to be on this issue. We're now in the era of Citizens United, and we're seeing the full consequences of that ruling. The numbers were staggering from this last election. I think something like 10 people in America spent more than 80 or 90% of the rest of the American people combined in their campaign contributions when you add in all of these shadowy groups and independent expenditures. So we got a big problem, and it does distort our democracy in a big way. They were unsuccessful in large measure. They failed to unseat President Obama. Democrats actually gained ground in the House and in the Senate, but it took a Herculean effort. And that's not the way I think any of us want our election cycles to play out indefinitely. So we've got to do something about it, and I think the most important thing we can do is simply overturn that Supreme Court decision. Since I don't think the Supreme Court composition is going to change that much in the next few years so that we could get them to revisit the decision, we really do have to amend the Constitution, and I'm co-sponsoring a constitutional amendment to do that.
And the president's campaign has now morphed into Organizing for America. And using the Citizens United rules, they can accept unlimited amounts of contributions. They are voluntarily disclosing their donors, but they don't have to. And this makes me uncomfortable because we move into the permanent campaign, and I'm still getting 5 emails a day. What's your take on that? And do you think that the president is setting a bad precedent through this effort?
Well, I don't feel completely comfortable with it either, Peter, but I also don't think unilateral disarmament in the face of Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and Karl Rove and all of these other forces that are absolutely going to continue doing this is going to be the answer. I think we're going to have to fight fire with fire for a while, as ironic or unpleasant as that seems. I think what the president has built and what he's now deploying on these issues is one of our best hopes. And when you talk about a constitutional amendment, first thing you got to do is get it through Congress and then get it ratified by the appropriate number of states. It's going to be the mother of all organizing challenges. We're going to need something like that.
But OFA is not explicitly supporting a constitutional amendment, is it?
I haven't heard them explicitly supporting it at this point, but certainly the president's been very critical of Citizens United. So my hope is that this would be included in the short list of issues they're taking on. Now, one reason may be that they're just very focused on the gun violence issue right now, which I don't second guess at all. I think that's an appropriate focus, and I'm actually somewhat hopeful that their work and Mr. Bloomberg's work, which by the way is another big money power play, it just happens to be on our side. You know, you sort of take your friends where you find them in these battles, and I think we desperately need to do something about gun violence. I don't, again, feel totally comfortable with the way Mr. Bloomberg is throwing his money around, but part of me is also grateful that he's on our side and that he's helping give us a chance to help keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill and people that would hurt kids and people.
I'm going to jump to the gun question and shift around a little bit in my mind. We recently saw what 90% of the country wants to be law go down and not even really get a vote in the Senate. There's a lot of talk about the administration coming back, Senator Reid bringing it back for a vote in the Senate. And even if something like that common sense gun laws gets through the Senate, when it gets over to you guys in the House, it just looks to me, as I read the papers and hear people talking about this, that it's dead on arrival.
I don't necessarily agree, Larry. We've introduced a companion bill that mirrors the Toomey Manchin background check bill. I'm a co-sponsor, an original co-sponsor. We've got 3 Republicans who have signed up as original co-sponsors. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you run the numbers, the Democrats have 201 seats right now in the House of Representatives. If Elizabeth Colbert Bush wins next week, we will only be 16 short of the 218 needed to pass legislation. So you don't need that many Republicans to come over, assuming you can hold most of your Democratic votes, which I think we will be able to do. And I think there's going to be enormous public pressure. In a sense, I think this first time through with the Senate, and we're not done in the Senate, there will be more votes. And sort of the aftermath of it, as you've seen people like Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire and Jeff Flake in Arizona watch their poll numbers tank. As you've seen people like Mary Landrieu in Louisiana watch her poll numbers actually rise heading into a tough race in an election year. People are watching that. And there are a lot of members of both the House and the Senate that are in marginal districts that could go either way. The public is with us on this, overwhelmingly. And with the organizing help from the President and OFA and Bloomberg and others, and Gabby Giffords, and some remarkable work that's going on. The Vice President is just on a mission on this. He's going to be everywhere in the country. I think we can get our votes.
Well, you're looking at it from as if the glass is half full, and that's great. which brings up another issue on how you all make laws. I look at, sometimes hear a law has been passed in Congress, and then it goes to something that they call this conference committee, and what comes out is something either watered down or changed or something that you didn't even vote for.
Yeah.
I don't really understand that. I don't think a lot of people do. Can you explain how that all works?
Well, there's lots of ways you can come to be voting on things that nobody's ever seen that were just added. The continuing resolution that we passed to avoid a government shutdown a little over a month ago had all sorts of things that at the last minute the Senate added by way of amendments. And we were talking before the show about the Monsanto rider. Terrible piece of legislation that gives special legal protection to Monsanto for these field trials of genetically engineered seed and literally prevents courts from even intervening to protect the public interest, which I think raises some separation of powers and other issues. But in any event, it's a terrible piece of public policy, and there were others. There were all kinds of bad things in that. Came to the House on a take it or leave it vote with virtually no notice. Many members of Congress were almost reading the next day or the day after all of the things that had been loaded in. It's a terrible process, and sometimes that can happen by way of a conference committee. Sometimes it can just happen in riders at the last minute from the other house, and then a quick up or down vote in the House of Origin.
That would seem to me just an invitation for special interest to sit on the side and at the last minute come in and dump.
You think?
Well, I do think. I mean, and
it is. It's terrible.
Can anything be done about that? Is that just the way it is?
I think just shining as much of a bright light as you can, just knowing that this game of adding riders at the last minute has been going on for a long time and will continue to. So I think all of us need to be more aware. I need to make sure my staff is ready on very short notice to peel into all of the things that come in last minute amendments. The same thing happened in Sacramento a lot, by the way. And I know that you were an advocate in Sacramento, you followed that, but people, instead of introducing bills in the ordinary course at the beginning of the year, running them through committee hearings, they would hold them back, and then when somebody needed that one vote to pass the budget, or whatever the case would be, Abel Maldonado would suddenly have all these bill ideas,
lieutenant governor.
Right? And that's no way to run a state, it's no way to run the U.S. Congress, but it's just a tactic that is used all too often.
It's amazing.
Jared, I'd like to learn more about some of your foreign policy views.
Yeah.
Do you support Israel's call for a preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities? And if so, what role would the United States play?
Well, no, I don't support a preemptive strike right now on Iran. I don't support taking military orders from other countries as well. But Israel is an important ally to the United States, and I do take the threat of nuclear-armed Iran very seriously. Basically, the answer is I support the president's approach on this, which has been very careful but firm, laying out a line that we're not going to let Iran acquire nuclear weapons. If they do, we're going to see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia and others that will lead, I'm afraid, to actual nuclear conflict in a terrible way with terrible consequences. So we need to stop that from happening. But diplomacy and sanctions and economic pressure are the tools that have to be focused on right now. So I'm not comfortable with folks who want to kind of run us up to war and draw all these red lines. I think we're seeing in Syria right now how tricky these red lines can be. You can draw them all you want, but you don't always have perfect intelligence. And sometimes the choices, when you think these red lines have been crossed, are not between good and bad, they're between
worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Syria, and that is our next question. What do you think is a trigger point for U.S. expanded involvement and the imposition of a no-fly zone?
Well, I'm not sure a no-fly zone is a good option for us in Syria. I think at some point, if you're going to have these safe areas or no-fly zones, you have to kind of project your sovereignty into those countries. I think you've got to have boots pretty close to on the ground in order to make some of that happen. And I just don't see Syria as a place where military options make a lot of sense at this point. It is disintegrated into sectarian violence with all sorts of sides fighting each other. One of the fastest growing and most effective sides right now has sworn its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So are we there then going in to try to help them take over the country? Are we helping others that are backed by Iran in the south? Our choices are terrible in Syria, and of course we want to prevent humanitarian damage to the civilian population. But at this point, I feel like there are no good choices. Of the bad choices, probably leaning on Russia to play a more constructive role with Assad is maybe the best card we have.
Let's move closer to home. You sign on to a letter opposing the TSA's plan to relax some of the airport security rules. I think it had something to do with allowing small knives to get on board.
Yeah.
Do you feel that TSA needs that much oversight from Congress, or should they have some latitude in doing what they're supposed to be doing and charged to do to help everyday Americans?
Well, every agency needs some oversight from Congress. We're the folks that have to go back and talk to people and carry their views forward on the representative side of government. And I think when you see a policy that suddenly out of nowhere says you can start bringing knives on planes again, a lot of people are concerned. I was stunned to hear that. I don't hear a lot of outcry from pocket knife enthusiasts about needing to carry their knife on planes.
Right.
So I don't really understand what solution, what problem rather TSA was trying to solve. And I think
but isn't TSA's point that with the hardened cabins, the cockpits, that the risk of a small knife being used to hijack a plane is sharply reduced?
Well, talk to a flight attendant about that. They're not so sanguine about the whole thing. The bottom line here, I think the fact that TSA actually pulled back this proposal kind of tells you something. I think they were hearing it from people all over the place, not just members of Congress. I was just part of the chorus that said, bad idea.
Jared, just a final quick question regarding the Drakes Bay oyster farm. It now has some unusual allies, a legal foundation supported by the Koch brothers and Senator David Vitter, who wanted to attach a lease extension to an offshore drilling bill. In 20 seconds, what's the best way forward?
20 seconds?
Yes.
Wow, Peter, that's generous.
You just lost 3.
The clock is ruthless.
There is no great way forward at this point. I am constantly being urged by constituents on both sides of this to join in with one of the combating, warring sides. It's been a hugely divisive issue. I've never seen it as one that was completely black and white. I think there's been some merit to both sides. What I've chosen to do, instead of second-guessing the Secretary of Interior's decision on wilderness designation, I am focusing entirely on the ranches and dairies that are going to continue in the park and trying to make sure that they have a good relationship with the Park Service and that they have the long-term assurances and the kind of support that they need to keep providing that agricultural character to West Marin, which I think is very important.
Congressman Jared Huffman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.